We're here to talk about Asia's energy demand and changing nature of demand. Asia has been forecast to grow, Asian demand has been forecast to grow by 37% by 2025. And as a result of this growth, it's expected to see an increase in energy imports of around 53%. However, due to the volatility in the price of oil, as well as the pollution in metros seen in China and India, there's been a growing transition of these economies to a more decarbonized energy model. So we have with us, today we'll be joined by a few panelists from Korea, China, as well as the Atlantic Council. And I'm pleased to introduce on stage today David Hobbs, Senior Fellow, Global Energy Center from the Atlantic Council. Wang, Director General, Energy Research Institute, National Development and Reform Commission. Yongsung, President, Korea Energy Economics Institute. As well as Anatol Feygin, Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer from Cheniere Energy. Thank you. I'm going to begin with David, and just to try and get a sense of how the recent movements in the price of oil, recent impacts of the energy markets have had on the economy, and their behavior. So starting with David, how has the recent volatility actually impacted growing economies of China and India?
Well, thanks, Jennifer, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting us all. The first thing I'd say is we need to define terms. What do we mean by volatility? Are we talking about daily changes in price? Are we talking about monthly, yearly, or I can talk. Microphone doesn't matter, but I suspect when it switches on, you're not going to like it. Have we got a handheld phone just so we can avoid the problem? Are we going to? Okay, we'll keep going. Very low. There's a comedian who does this act where he pretends his microphone is failing.
There we are.
And he makes an absolute fortune. So is that okay? So I think what matters far more to Asian economies is not what the daily or weekly volatility is. It's what are the expectations of price for the longer term. Do they expect that they're going to be making investments on the assumption of $50 a barrel and find it's going to be 80? Do they make investments on the basis it's going to be 100 and find it's going to be 40? And what we've certainly seen has been a demand response to prices having increased from the low points they reached a couple of years ago, and people now being relatively comfortable that a range, maybe it's going to be above 60, maybe it's going to be below 80. That doesn't mean it's going to stay within that range, but that's an expectation range. And so you're starting to see greater consensus around forecasts of demand for oil particularly, but energy pricing more generally seems to be perceived as becoming more stable in terms of the investment decisions that are being made. So in terms of how has volatility affected, I don't think volatility is really the right measure. It's what's the expectation of long-term prices and how are people making capital deployments in those economies. And that's the reason you're seeing, on the one hand, strong demand growth absent a major recession, but at the same time, investments in greater efficiency, moving the economy away, particularly in the case of China, moving the economy away from industrial GDP to consumer-led GDP, and that has a big impact on future energy demand growth, both positive and negative, depending on which fuels, and I know we'll get into fuel mix later in the conversation.
And Mr. Wang, we had a chat just before we started the session, and you mentioned China's longer-term growth objectives and longer-term views on energy. How are you looking at your energy mix, let's say, in 10 years' time? What has been China's view, in spite of the volatility in oil prices, to transition its economy?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. You know, up to the end of last year, I think China oil import accounts the total primary energy maybe reaches 70%. That means that our oil 70% depends on the foreign market. So this is they say that China will be big influence the international oil market. But from my own view, I don't think the international oil market, the price will exceed the, in other words, I think that will keep the $50 level from my own view. I can simply explain this. Global energy transition, that is on-backing trends, especially for China, is a big issue. Our energy mix. Inside domestic PM 2.5 issues, everybody know that the international pressures, climate change. So our heavy energy, carbon energy mix is our problem. So we must go to the energy transition, these are the rules. Energy transition. For international market influence, I think China will take the big influence, but China will, in the next 20 or 30 years, I think will reduce the oil consumptions. So if oil price increase quickly, that will speed the China energy transition. If the oil keeps the $50 levels, that will help China energy transition and also help the neighboring countries. For example, today our topic is about Southern Asian energy demand. Southern energy demand. That my meaning is big countries should help the small countries, because China already very huge bodies. If that the China transition quickly, it is very difficult. But small countries, they should start more high level. That start. Their transitions is very easy. So China could help the neighboring countries is develop more and more, for example, hydropower, wind, and the solar PV, and this. In the same time, China also makes the energy transitions. So I don't think in future we will influence the oil markets increase. We will help oil markets keep the $50 levels. Thank you.
Mr. Yongsung, short term, we've seen Korean refiners enjoy high margins of profitability when it comes to the price of oil, which has been, for the last 3 years, fairly low, and that has resulted in huge profit margins. What are your views short term, before we move to the long-term transition of the Korean economy? What are your concerns in Korea at the moment, with oil prices perhaps poised to increase?
Okay. Actually, many things to say about the oil price. Actually, price volatility is very important, because price volatility is very important main source of uncertainty. According to the Korean Development Institute, they analyze very interesting outcome, the relationship between oil price and economic growth rate and cost of living. According to their report, if the price of crude oil is $60 per barrel, then make economic growth rate increase by 0.1%, and also decrease living cost decreased by 0.1%. But if the crude oil price increased to $84 per barrel, then economic growth rate decreased by 0.2%, and living cost increased by 0.2%. So that means the Korean economy and also living cost is very volatility to oil price. But in terms of industry of refinery, we have 4 different big refinery, like as GS Caltex, Hyundai Oil Bank, S-Oil, SK. Those 4 big refinery industries, different story. For example, they import lots of crude oil from the Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, some other Eastern country, and then they refine to crude oil, and then they produce lots of petroleum product. In 2015, they produced lots of petroleum product. Their amount of petroleum product is about 1 billion barrels. And then among them, they sell 46% of total petroleum product to 66 different countries. So that means South Korea, we can not produce crude oil, but we import a lot, and then we make different petroleum product and export other countries. So refinery is very important to Korea. But before I came here, I checked future of Korean refinery industry. They say in 2000s, they call golden age of Korean refinery industry. But right now, they say another golden age. So they say silver age. That means not much to 2000. But right now, we have very good condition to refine our system. But they have challenge. They have some risky situation. One is because of China. China invests lots of money to refinery facility. And also Middle East. Used to be they export crude oil, but right now they changed the policy, so they invest lots of money to refinery facility. And also another one is petrochemical product, they need naphtha. But naphtha and LPG and aviation oil is very important, but gasoline or diesel, the demand of those things is getting decreased. So that means refinery company, they are thinking about how can make a balancing to naphtha and gasoline or diesel something. Okay, yeah.
And coming to Anatol, now this transition in Asian economies has led to an increase in the demand for gas. Just want to hear your thoughts on how the demand for LNG has been, what you've seen so far in China, for instance, and the rest of Asia, and what you're likely to see in 2019 as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's been a very robust couple of years in Asian gas demand, as my fellow panelists mentioned. The transition towards cleaner fuels, obviously renewables and obviously natural gas are helping that transition. The LNG market overall in 2018, these data are preliminary, but grew again a little over 10% after about a comparable growth rate in 2017. So it's been a very good couple of years for the LNG market. And that market growth has been driven by Asia, and that Asian component has been driven by China. So just in terms of a few numbers, the market, LNG market today is a little over 320 million tons per annum. The growth last year was 30 million tons. Asia's growth in demand was 30 million tons. So the rest of the world kind of balanced out with some pluses and minuses. Within that growth of 30 million tons, China, both on an annual and quarterly basis, was more than half of that incremental demand. So it's been a very robust market. It's been enabled in large part by the additional supply, of course, that's come on from the Australian projects as well as the US projects, where Cheniere has the honor of being the market leader, and we're continuing to grow that platform. We have 4 trains operating today, 2 more in commissioning. more under construction. We'll get to 40 million tons just with that portfolio, and we'll continue to grow from there. And that growth is enabled by the incremental demand that we're seeing out of Asia. So that is a symbiosis that I fully expect to continue. And again, China is going to be, for the foreseeable future, a very large driver of natural gas demand and LNG as well.
And to Mr. Wang, how important is gas to China's energy mix?
That's a good question. You know, China energy mix heavily depends on the fossil fuels. So China's central government also has a very clear strategy for energy transitions. Just as I said, so far China, the body is too big. Transition is not very easy. Not very easy. So gas, comparing the coal, oil, that's more clean. So during the, I can say the first phase, maybe I think the energy transition in China, at least the 3 phases. Firstly, the first phase. So far, that's still first phase because our fossil fuels still account almost 90%, 86% of total primary energies. So as I said, this is the first phase. Our priority strategies is reduce the coal consumptions. So during the first phase, if we can use more and more gas, that will help us to successful the first phase transitions. The second phase, that the fossil fuel and the renewable energy is a balance. Is a balance phase, maybe the 50% to 50%. This is the second phase. But that way, we don't need. We even maybe need to reduce the oils, gas consumptions. So we can go to the third phase. The third phase is that the renewable energy and other clean energy will be, how to say, at least the 2/3 of the total primary energies. So this is my view about the gas in China.
I also want to bring in some policy perspective. The recent trade war, for instance, has seen restrictions placed on US LNG imports by China. And we're also expected to see more US shale entering the Asian energy markets. What has been the impact, and what sort of impact can we foresee this year? I'd like to start with you and then move on to Anatol.
By all means, but before we get onto that, can I just pick up on a point that Dr. Wang made? And I think it's really critical to an understanding of the global gas market and the Asian gas market. Because if you remember, 3 years ago, everyone knew for a fact that the world was going to be oversupplied with LNG. It was very difficult to find a dissenting view, and the basis of that was a vast expansion of supply, but that the two potentially large importers, China and India, would not be prepared to pay the price necessary for LNG to come into their markets in a big way. What changed was the realization that social stability and public health was being affected by air quality, and people were prepared to pay that price. And so China went from nobody expecting huge imports to now China becoming the dominant share of growth. Big question on a pan-Asian basis, will India be the next to say we are prepared to pay the price it takes for LNG for the good of air quality and public health? Now, why am I saying that before answering a question about what will happen with shale going into Asia and particularly China? China will face a calculation. Should it make it harder to get gas at low cost into China at the potential risk to public stability and health, or will it rely upon the fungibility of markets, so maybe American gas doesn't arrive in China, it goes to other places in Asia, and the gas that would have gone to those other places comes to China? somehow or other, I suspect that the quantities of gas going into Asia will be totally unaffected by sanctions, or sorry, not sanctions, by tariffs rather. But exactly whose gas goes where may be up for discussion, but even that I doubt. I suspect that the imperative of increasing gas in the mix, for all the good reasons that that would be the case, will win through in the end.
What are you anticipating?
Well, it's hard to add much to David's comments, but as I mentioned before, China was more than half of the growth in LNG demand last year. The numbers throughout the year are relatively constant. Fourth quarter, post the 10% tariff on US LNG, as David said, going into China, was implemented. The fourth quarter was largely unaffected by the growth rate that you saw in China's LNG demand. In terms of the North American value proposition, I think most forecasters, again deferring to David's point that most forecasters got things wrong in terms of this glut that was expected in 16, 17, 18 that never materialized, do think that the U.S. supply in LNG is going to continue to grow meaningfully. We certainly at Cheniere are going to do our part to ensure that. What we can control is the ability of the U.S. LNG complex to bring liquefaction facilities online on time, on budget, as we have to date. The producer community and the capital raising function that producer community undergoes has been incredibly efficient at continuing to drive down costs and put more gas on the market. We have thousands upon thousands of producers that are increasingly successful in bringing down the cost of the raw material, if you will, that feeds our plants. So we fully expect the U.S. complex and the Canadian complex to continue to grow and put more LNG on the market. We continue to expect Asia to continue to grow, and we think we have a bright future in China. It would be unfair for me to say that I'm not against these tariffs that have been in place. I think it's additional friction in the market, but as David points out, the LNG will go to that market, and it's a market that today is large enough and liquid enough to appropriately distribute the molecules to their most economically efficient destinations. So we don't see it as a big impediment, but we would prefer it wasn't there.
And Mr. Wang, what is your take on the tariffs in place and impact on how China sources gas?
I'm not sure of this, but my view is if the gas price increase too much, I think we will move to other energy source. So this is double side issues. In one point, I think no matter not only the gas price tariff issue and also oil price issues. This is if both these increase quickly, I think that will speed China's energy transition, not only the energy, and also will speed the global energy transitions. So that's why I said international oil tariff cannot increase high.
Also, David, sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt, David. So actually the LNG is very important for the Japan and Korea and also China. For example, Japan, I'm not proper person to talking about the Japan, but as you may know, in the 2012, there is one big accident for nuclear accident. So that means after nuclear accident, the Japan, they need transit from the nuclear power to LNG. And also South Korea, we have very big transition process. That means we change coal fire to LNG fire something, and also including renewable energy. So that means we need two things to solve. One is how can we secure to get LNG? We need secure supply from the all around to meet our demand for LNG, because demand of LNG is increasing in China, Korea, and Japan. But so far, 3 different countries, we don't have cooperation. So far, we compete together. So nowadays, we want to cooperation together in LNG, this China, Korea, and South. And second thing is we need to deal with price. LNG cost is much expensive compared to the coal. So even though China, Korea, Japan increase the portion of LNG, but we have to deal with price and cost. But so far, we don't have any best solution. So we have to keep discussion about that one. Yes, that's all.
And also, Anatol, speaking of costs, high shipping rates, etc., what sort of impact has that had on supplies from the US reaching Asian markets, in the spot prices, I mean?
Well, I think when you talk about spot market, true spot markets, you really have to take into account spot economics of all components of that chain. And as that market continues to grow, as the LNG market grows and the US business model adds more flexibility with destination flexibility, et cetera, to that equation, the spot market will become more of a factor, but it's still predominantly a term business, right? So you're absolutely right, shipping rates did move up pretty dramatically from the middle of last year. Until the middle of last year, they were fairly depressed. They were well below the economics of contracting new builds. And as the US market and the demand that we just talked about in Asia really picked up, the shipping capacity was absorbed and shipping rates did move up dramatically. We at Cheniere have relatively minimal exposure to that. A vast majority of our shipping is either on a long-term basis or contracts that we entered into before those economics moved up. So while the market spot rate for shipping says that the shipping is the single biggest component of moving North American gas to Asia, that is really only true if you went out and chartered a ship today. Now, those shipping rates, as vessels have been delivered and as demand has seasonally moderated somewhat, those shipping rates have come down dramatically. But even in that worst-case scenario economics, when you were buying the winter-priced natural gas in North America at a little over $4, the Asian delivered price was over $9. So even the spot economics were attractive to move volumes into the Pacific market. Today, the spot economics are relatively more attractive to move volumes into Europe, and Europe had a very good year in 2018 in the aggregate, in part driven by that spike in shipping rates. But again, this is still fundamentally a long-term business, and on a long-term basis, those long-term charter rates are still today below where the spot prices are. So that's primarily what drives the economics of our business.
I also want, sorry.
May I add one thing? I'm sorry about that. When we're talking about the price of LNG, we have to thinking about another possibility to supply. For example, the South Korea, we're thinking about the pipeline natural gas rather than liquefied natural gas. So far, even though we have want to get natural gas from Russia, but there is something like an obstacle to get at that one. That means North Korea. But if we have very good peace, some different change between South Korea and North Korea, then we can build pipeline natural gas from Russia. So that means make the price of natural gas cheaper and compared to the before. So he mentioned about the spot market for LNG. So maybe in the future, it's just nobody know about the future. But if the South Korea and North Korea, we have some very good condition, then we build another pipeline in the Russian, then we can get some more big portion of natural gas from the Russia by the PNG. Then maybe the LNG market will change. But I don't know how come. So just this is something like one possibility.
It's a long-term possibility.
Yeah.
Also, speaking of air quality, which you mentioned earlier, India recently cancelled 14 coal projects. It's something that activists and campaigners had launched. There have been lots of protests in India. Are we finally seeing decarbonization efforts pick up in Asian economies, in India and in China?
I'm not sure I would describe them as decarbonization. I'd describe them as desmogification, if you like. Okay. Because I think the protests were about today's air quality, not long-term carbon dioxide. But the specifics of the Indian power market, which is what those coal-fired power stations would have served, are bizarre in the sense that you have a chronically underserved population who want lots of power. Unfortunately, a large proportion who don't actually pay for power because it's cheaper to give it to them for free than to actually set up the billing system. You have a lot of unused capacity in the power system, so you didn't actually need those 14 coal-fired power stations. So I think it's a good bit of PR to say we've cancelled those. It helps settle a number of arguments, but it's not really a harbinger of long-term decarbonization. I think decarbonization in Asia is a really interesting thing. It's much more talked about than actually seen because governments in Asia put welfare generation, in other words, economic growth and development, ahead of long-term decarbonization. And they always will. Maslow's triangle continues to exist and to explain behavior. If you remember nothing else today, I'm sure there'll be some really interesting stuff said tomorrow, but if you remember nothing else today, remember what Secretary Moniz said, which is that the cost of decarbonized energy across the entirety of the energy ecosystem, when you take into account particularly long-term seasonal storage, is too high compared to the fossil fuel alternatives. That if we don't invest far more in making decarbonized energy cost-effective for developing economies without the need to charge a premium or to subsidize decarbonized energy or to charge a premium for emitting carbon, then the game's never going to move on. We're gonna keep bashing on, trying to say, let's do more of the thing that hasn't worked for the last 10 to 20 years, rather than actually getting pragmatic and saying, let's do something new that might work. So just remember what Ernie Moniz said. We should be investing 10, maybe 100 times more in innovation to reduce the cost of decarbonized energy so we don't require a carbon price for that transition, rather than trying to find new and exciting ways of penalizing fossil fuels to a point where only rich countries can afford to decarbonize.
I agree with you that it made for good PR when it came to that announcement by the ministry. But one of the reasons they cited was falling costs of solar, which they said, we're adding capacities in the solar space in India.
There are two. So there are two things. There are two kinds of electricity in India. There is, I'm just grateful to have electricity when it's on, and that solar is much the cheapest thing for that. And then there is what I call modern electricity, which is when I turn the switch on, it's going to be there. Now, India in the short term has got excess dispatchable capacity, so it can integrate solar with its overbuilt coal and to extent other fossil fuel plants. But in the long run, if India achieves its economic growth aspirations, then it's going to run out of that firm capacity. And solar is not yet cheaper anywhere in the world on a full cycle basis without being integrated into a dispatchable system. If it was, then it wouldn't require any kind of subsidy. So if I just want electrons, yes, solar is the cheapest marginal cost of electrons, particularly in this region, incidentally. But in terms of a fully functioning, modern, seasonally adjusting power system, it's not there yet. So it's capacity already. But in the long run, when India gets to a point where it's got a terawatt of dispatchable capacity or a terawatt of load, solar on its own just can't meet that, not at a cost-effective price.
And how important is solar to the energy mix in China?
Solar, and just mentioned the decarbonizations. That's a solar, wind. That's a very important elements. But my own view is I want to say is transition, energy transition or decarbonization. We should consider the energy, economic, environment, circling development. How to say, we should find a way how make this is a good circling development. So far, I think only one way we can see very clear that is increase the end user's electrification rate. So final energy, we should use more and more electricities. You want to use more and more electricities, you should change, you should make your economic transition. For example, so far in China, everybody know our electricity vehicles, manufacturers, and the market that expand and expand. Your electricity market increase, you will give the more space for wind and solar. You give the more space wind and solars, and you must use the more and the electricity. I just give examples. Each electricity vehicles that also is non-cost energy storage equipment. Energy storage equipment. If all of the electric vehicles combine into the power system, when we have more and more wind and solar, we can storage the electricity. When we have when we have the peak electricity, we can use the electricity vehicle supply electricity to the grid. So I just give examples. In future, electrification is very good and also very important element for the energy transition, for the decarbonization. That's okay.
I think we have a question here.
Yes, hello, Cornelia Meyer from yes, okay, Cornelia Meyer from Meyer Resources. My question goes mainly to Cheniere, and it's about the LNG supply. With U.S. LNG supply, and leading it, coming in quite heavily, what does that mean for the balance of suppliers? It may become marginally more expensive to ship and less profitable to ship LNG from Qatar into, let's say, into China. There's Australia also. So how do you see this? You coming in as a new source of LNG, unsettling the conventional contracts going forward? Will you see, let's say, Qatari LNG go more towards Europe and so on?
Well, a couple of comments there. I think one of the advantages of the U.S. business model is its flexibility and the full destination flexibility that it offers. So, the crystal ball is always kind of fuzzy, but the answer is the LNG globally at the margin will flow to the highest price market. And the U.S. has been a key contributor, the business model has been a key contributor to the evolution of the LNG market with those diversions and flexibilities. Over the last couple of years, Cheniere started operations in February of 2016, so it's still a relatively new business, but today it's had a very dramatic impact on the global market, almost 30 million tons being exported out of the U.S. Again, Cheniere, of course, is a couple years ahead of the competition there. But we think that there are two key components to the U.S. model continuing to be attractive and continuing to grow. One is the upstream economics that we have in U.S. and Canada. When we started out in 2011 and signed our initial long-term offtake deals, as you looked out on the NYMEX crystal ball, prices for 2018, 19, 20 were $6.5, $7. by the time we got here, there were few excursions above $4, right? So that part of the equation has come in much better for the buyers than anybody expected. And then on the liquefaction side, we've delivered the projects ahead of schedule, under budget, et cetera. So our cost per ton of incremental capacity is relatively more attractive than anywhere else in the world. Of course, you can't argue with the fact that whatever the shipping rates are, it's cheaper from certain parts of the world to ship into Asia than it is from North America. In fact, virtually all parts of the world are cheaper, but that's becoming a smaller and smaller component as ships become more efficient and as the long-run economics of shipping have also come down. So we are disadvantaged from a transportation standpoint. We think we're very advantaged from an upstream and an infrastructure development standpoint. And as the market has continued to grow and rationalize, basically the competitive landscape says, can you deliver into this growing Asian market somewhere between $7.50 and $8.50 on a landed basis? And as long as we can be competitive with that, we think we've got a bright future enabled by our brethren in the upstream world that continue to get more efficient and continue to put more gas on the market. The US in the last year and a half, from a natural gas standpoint, grew by a Norway. So as long as that keeps going, we should be in pretty good shape.
We have another question here.
May I add something?
Sorry.
So even though the distance between USA to Asia compared to the Asian country to Middle East, but we have to think about the quality of natural gas. For example, USA, Canada, they produce different quality of natural gas. So even though the distance is short, but the quality is different, or maybe low quality compared to the Middle East. And then maybe there is something like prices goes up and goes down. So we have to carefully compare both things, just not transportation cost.
Thank you.
My name is Etna Trainer. Just a question, if I may. We were recently, and indeed you were there, Anatol, at an energy conference in Bangkok, where the energy minister there, Dr. Siri, very much talked about the fact that Bangkok would take the lead in almost an alliance of countries that would actually be looking at the renewable energy and the great demand that's there. Now, you're not as convinced, David, on this one. As you said, there's a lot of more talk than action, perhaps, in Asia. Because, again, I think there's a huge demand, and they've got to find whatever available fuel is there, and the demand is so big. So were you encouraged? Did you see that this was, and maybe you'll both come in on this, can Thailand actually lead that alliance that moves the whole renewable agenda to more practicality? But it did seem there was a lot of investment going on. I was rather surprised from the other countries and the many representations that were there that there was a lot more commitment and a lot more investment in renewable, because I think they've really looked at the energy demand, how fast it's growing, and they have to deliver basically all sorts of energy.
Well, if I may start, a couple of years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago, I was pretty surprised to look at the statistics in the year that just passed to find out that over half of the incremental installed capacity in power generation was in fact renewables globally. So I was surprised by that once. I haven't been surprised by that since. The world keeps getting better at deploying renewables, as David said, on a sort of, if you measure it against the benchmark of what we've come to rely upon of 99+% reliability, there are network costs that still make intermittent renewables meaningfully more expensive. And, but those costs are continuing to come down, and I wish all countries continued success in deploying renewables, and I think that natural gas has a role to play in that aggregate solution. It's much easier in places like Thailand, where you have a natural gas economy with a declining indigenous resource, and so you're not fighting alongside all of the other issues, the uphill battle of investing and developing infrastructure. The infrastructure largely exists. You need to plug in a new source of natural gas, and FSRUs have made LNG a relatively easy incremental supply to plug in, but renewables will continue to take market share there as well as globally.
Can I just clarify? My smile was not about whether or not there would be more renewables installed. It was the idea that in terms of where leadership in this would lie, Thailand is not the only country to have offered to lead and coordinate Asia, and Asia seems to be lacking a leader and coordinator in a number of different areas. So the smile was about the likelihood of that crystallizing it. But to the point, and Anatol's right, in terms of installed capacity, nameplate capacity, in terms of the amount of energy capable of being delivered, it's substantially less than half of all capacity, and it's from a very low base. And so all I suppose I would want to leave you the impression is there's a lot of good stuff going on, but the amount of noise you hear about it would make you think it was far more substantial than it really is in the overall energy mix. And the economies of Asia are not relying upon renewables alone to meet their long-term energy needs. They're investing in reliable, low-cost power as well.
So last round of questioning on the long-term view of Asia's energy mix and what role fossil fuels will continue to play in this sort of mix. I'll start with you, Yongsung.
Okay. It will really depend on how can we see, for example, fuel. For the fuel, demand of fuel will be decreasing because we can replace gasoline car and diesel car, replace to the electric vehicle or hydro car. And also, but we can think about the petrochemical industry. They need lots of crude oil to produce another product. So that means when we think about the fuel, then the long-term demand of oil will be decreased. But if we see oil as some raw material, then the demand of raw material will be increased. So we don't know. Something is negative, something is positive. But still, the portion of oil will be important in South Korea. For example, actually we try to reduce the coal and nuclear power plant, and then we try to increase the portion of renewable energy and gas. But still, the portion of oil will be still high. For example, in terms of primary energy, right now the portion of oil is 41%. That goes to 29% in 2030. So that means we try to decarbonizing to fossil fuel, but still the role of oil is still important in South Korea.
The reality for China.
Okay. I think in the next 30 years, I mean, up to the middle of this century, 2050, include China, the Asia energy demand increase rate keep the 1.5%. I think this is a normal rate, not high. This is fixed. But non-fixed issue is that's the energy mix. That is not fixed. Will be changed. It will be changed. From the global energy transition trend, I think the energy mix will big change. But so far it's difficult to forecast this. But anyway, I have the one view. If we can, through the, the three kindizations. First, industrial, increase electrification rate. Sub-industrial or trade should be smartization. The third one, electricity should be greenization. If we follow this is the three kindizations, I think energy demand, meet the energy demand, Asian energy demand, no problem.
David.
I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way, which is that over the next 30 years, the cost of providing energy services, basically energy and the things that energy does for us, is going to be a critical determinant of the competitiveness of economies, and countries are going to focus on making sure that the cost of their energy services are as low as possible. I predict, therefore, that in terms of the long-term energy mix, it's going to include more fossil fuels than most people are predicting and most people want to see. Because that is going to continue, when push comes to shove, to provide the lowest cost suite of energy services. That doesn't mean that we won't see a dramatic reduction in cost of energy overall, but what we know is when something becomes cheaper and is at least as convenient or useful as it was before, demand for it always goes up. And so we may well see that the proportion of fossil fuels in the Asian energy mix is lower than it was, but the amount of fossil fuels consumed in Asia will probably be higher than it is today. That's as far as, and that's as brave as I'm prepared to be.
Thank you. That's all we have time for. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and for a very insightful discussion.